Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange doesn't shock because it's loud. It gets under your skin because it asks something we rarely let ourselves answer out loud. What happens when good is taken away as a choice? We follow Alex, charismatic, cruel, unapologetic, and then watch him stripped of choice by the Ludovico technique, a kind of state-administered aversion therapy that makes him physically unable to choose violence. On screen, it's clinical, disturbing, strangely tender in a way. The same montage that ruins him also removes the person who made those choices. The violence is graphic, yes, but the discomfort lingers long after the images fade because the film forces you to look at what being humane really means. When the movie opened, the reaction wasn't only moral outrage about brutality. Governments and audiences panicked at a deeper level. It was banned in several countries, and in Britain, Kubrick himself asked for it to be withdrawn after instances of so-called copycat crimes were blamed on viewers. That response tells you something important. The censorship wasn't purely about the spectacle of violence. It was about projection. People were terrified of seeing reflections of their own potential for harm, and even more terrified of admitting it. Think about that in everyday terms. We're comfortable praising someone for doing the right thing when it looks like a heroic deed. But what if that same person had been forced under threat or conditioning to never choose otherwise? Would we still call them virtuous? Parents face this with toddlers. You can lock a cookie jar so a child can't take a treat, but the moral lesson of resisting temptation is lost. The law faces it too. Punishment versus rehabilitation. Deterrence versus restoration. Kubrick collapses those abstractions into a single brutal experiment and dares us to answer. That's why audiences felt so unsettled. The film's true provocation is not the gore, but the question: is morality meaningful if it's manufactured? If the state can engineer good, has it turned citizens into machines? Obedient gears that look right but don't feel agency? When we applaud good behavior, are we celebrating virtue or simply effective control? And personally, away from film theory, that's a tough mirror to hold up. Who among us hasn't imagined a world where dangerous impulses are simply removed? It's seductive. But A Clockwork Orange warns that stripping choice strips humanity. The ethical discomfort is intimate. It asks us to consider our own capacity for harm, and whether we'd rather live with the risk of choice than the certainty of enforced benevolence. Kubrick didn't make a film about violence to titillate. He made one about responsibility, complicity, and the terrifying freedom of being able to choose wrong. The bans and the backlash were less about what the movie showed and more about what it made people admit, that the line between them and us might be thinner than we think. Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ didn't get attention because it was poorly made. It was because it forced an uncomfortable question. What happens when you imagine divinity feeling very human things? The film, adapted from Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, shows a Jesus who doubts, suffers, and, crucially, makes choices. For many viewers, that felt less like an interpretation and more like an affront. Governments and religious groups called it blasphemous. Some countries banned it outright and protests erupted on streets and in cinemas. But if you step back from the headlines, the real upset wasn't the story Scorsese chose to tell. It was the honesty of that story. We're used to representations of the sacred that are spotless and certain, statues that don't sweat, sermons that don't waver. Scorsese put a camera on a man who trembles in the garden, who wrestles with fear about what's to come, who imagines a life that could have been. That image is arresting because it reflects our private, quieter fears. The wish that faith would remove pain, the temptation to avoid sacrifice, the secret hope for a different path. Think about a time when you stood at a crossroads, when the right thing hurt, and the easier option gleamed like an unearned relief. Jesus, as presented in this film, knows that ache. He faces the seduction of safety, intimacy, and a normal life. The last temptation stages that inner trial not to scandalize, but to insist on a truth many of us recognize. Making meaning often requires making painful choices. To see divinity in that space upset systems built on certainty. Critics feared not the doubt itself, but that doubt made holy, that it could be seen without being erased. That's why the protests were so revealing. They weren't only about doctrine. They were a reaction to being shown a mirror. When a work of art forces believers to confront their own questions and vulnerabilities, it can feel like a betrayal. Yet Scorsese's film offers a different kind of fidelity, an honest engagement with the human condition. It doesn't diminish the sacred so much as expand the frame in which sacredness can exist. It asks whether holiness must exclude struggle or whether fidelity can include fear. For those of us not worried about doctrinal correctness, the film resonates precisely because it's human. It allows empathy for a figure often shrouded in certainty, and by doing so, it invites us to acknowledge our own contradictions without shame. Maybe that's uncomfortable. Maybe it's necessary. Faith, after all, has been tested in many forms, by skepticism, by tragedy, by quiet erosion. What The Last Temptation highlights is another kind of test, the test of honesty. It suggests that confronting the messy, lived reality of belief might be the truest way to sustain it. So the bans and the outrage tell us something important. Art that insists on honesty will disturb settled narratives. Whether you see that as dangerous or as brave depends on how you answer one question Scorsese's film quietly presses on you. Can holiness hold doubt? Or does honesty itself become heresy? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of those movies that doesn't rely on blood or special effects to leave a bruise on your head. What made it infamous and banned in several countries wasn't gallons of gore. What disturbed censors wasn't what they saw, it was what they felt. And that feeling is exactly what Tobe Hooper and his cast engineered. Think back to the last time a film made you squirm, not because of a jump or a scream, but because it felt uncomfortably real. That's the trick here. Hooper filmed on a shoestring budget, on 16mm, in real locations that smelled of sweat and rust. The camera work is raw, handheld, jittery, close up, never giving you time to sit back and rationalize. Lighting is natural and harsh. Faces are lit by whatever lamp or window is in the room. There's no glossy distance. The result is documentary-leaning realism, like someone accidentally turned on their home video at the worst possible moment. The violence in the movie is mostly implied. You hear the chainsaw, you see terrified reactions, you get blurred glimpses, but the film deliberately avoids lingering on torn flesh. That absence is what makes the scenes worse. Your imagination fills in the gaps, and because everything is staged to feel like it could be true, your mind supplies details that feel personal and immediate. It's not spectacle, it's suggestion. That makes it intimate and therefore more brutal. The family at the center of the film is ordinary enough to be terrifying. They eat at the kitchen table, they bicker, they butcher animals. They're not monsters in the mythic sense, they're familiar people twisted by isolation and cruelty. Leatherface's mask, stitched together from skin, is horrifying because it's a person pretending to be another person. The terror comes from the idea that identity is fragile, that human intimacy can be weaponized. It forces you to look at the thin veneer of civility and imagine what's underneath. Sound design plays a huge role in creating that closeness. The rev of the saw, the creak of floorboards, the low murmur of a distant conversation. These aren't musical cues, they're environmental details. Silence is used like an instrument. It stretches moments until you start to feel the actor's panic in your chest. The performances are deliberately unpolished. Sweat, throatiness, real exhaustion. So you don't watch actors playing terror. You watch people who seem to be experiencing it. There's also a cultural context that made the film land harder in the early 70s. America was reeling from Vietnam and social upheaval. Trust in institutions was eroding. The movie captures that sense of chaos bubbling under everyday life. It's not a cautionary allegory so much as an emotional mirror. If society can break down, then the horror feels possible, not fantastical. For many viewers, the film's power lies in its ability to turn familiar things, a farmhouse, a pickup truck, a family dinner, into sources of dread. It doesn't let you hide behind spectacle. Instead, it drags you into a moment that feels painfully immediate and human. Decades later, that intimacy is why it still haunts people. It doesn't just show cruelty, it makes you feel complicit in watching it unfold. Then came The Interview, a movie that, on paper, looked like another dumb comedy about celebrities getting into ridiculous trouble. It starred Seth Rogen and James Franco, and its punchline was outrageous. Two journalists recruited to assassinate North Korea's leader in a botched, laugh-filled mission. But the joke didn't stay on the screen. Before it ever hit theaters, it became an international incident. I remember following the story in real time and feeling a strange mix of amusement and unease. We're used to poking fun at politicians at dinner tables and on late-night shows, but this felt different. This time, the target was a sitting head of state, and the response was swift and serious. North Korea denounced the film, calling it an act of terrorism. Then Sony Pictures was hit by a massive cyber attack. Private emails leaked, internal documents exposed, and threats circulated online. Theatre chains pulled the plug. Several cinemas said they wouldn't screen the film after frightening messages warned of violent backlash. At that moment, a comedy had stopped being just a comedy. For a lot of us, that episode forced a rethink about what comedy actually does. We laugh at power because it humanizes it, because ridicule shrinks the untouchable. But The Interview showed how that act of defiance can ripple outward into real-world consequences, diplomatic tension, corporate paralysis, even a tangible fear in the physical spaces where we gather to watch films. Sony eventually reversed course and released the movie online and in a handful of independent theaters, but the damage was done. It proved that jokes can trigger cyber warfare and international headlines. On a personal level, the whole saga felt unsettling because it made me aware of how fragile creative freedom can be. I've cracked risky jokes at work and with friends, and I've felt that adrenaline, the tiny gamble. Most of the time, the worst that happens is an awkward silence. The Interview reminded me that sometimes the stakes are much higher. The punchline can become a provocation, and provocation can spawn retaliation. That's the paradox of satire. It's an inherently vulnerable form. It invites laughter, but it also invites reaction. When humor aims at those who wield real power, it can change the conversation. And sometimes it changes the world. The Interview didn't just lampoon a dictator, it forced a global debate about censorship, corporate responsibility, and cybersecurity. In doing so, it proved a stubborn truth. Laughter, when aimed at power, remains one of the most dangerous, and therefore one of the most vital weapons in art. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, Pasolini's deliberately enraging, deliberately unwatchable adaptation of Sade. It's not shocking for shock's sake. If you've heard the headlines, one of the most banned films in history. That's true, but it's only the start of the story. Pasolini took Sade's catalogue of cruelty and transposed it into the concrete nightmare of fascist Italy, and the result is a cinematic mirror most people don't want to look into. I remember my first encounter with Salo. I thought I was prepared for provocation, for affront. What got me was how systematic it all felt. The film doesn't rely on random acts of violence. It builds a bureaucratic ritual. A small circle of powerful men enact obscene rules, and a regiment of administrators, chauffeured through rooms and lists, turn humiliation into policy. The victims are stripped not only of clothes, but of language, identity, even the idea of consent. That cold administrative cruelty, the sort you can picture in a meeting room rather than on a battlefield, is what makes it so hard to watch. That's where the political message cuts through for me. This isn't just an exercise in depravity. Pasolini is arguing that absolute power dehumanizes everyone it touches. The rulers become mechanical, rehearsing cruelty as if it were governance. The victims, pushed into roles designed to erase them, at times begin to perform their own suppression. Power anesthetizes empathy and hollows out resistance. It turns both sides into instruments of the system. That's the ideological sting. It's not only that the powerful are monstrous, but that the system itself trains people to become complicit. Even the so-called victims can become carriers of the very brutality imposed on them. Censorship came easier than introspection. It's simpler to ban a movie and declare moral outrage than to sit with the idea that institutions we trust can behave in the same corrosive way. Pasolini knew this, and he wanted the audience to squirm. He wanted us to notice the parallels, the neat uniforms, the petty rituals, the casual cruelty in offices and parlors, all echoing a real political order. For many viewers, the film's extremity obscures the point. For others, the shock is the point. Either way, banning it became a way to close the conversation. I won't pretend Salo is easy to recommend. It is violent and dehumanizing in ways that can linger. But thinking of it only as scandal misses why Pasolini made it, as an accusation and an invitation. He forces you to ask uncomfortable questions about how obedience is manufactured, about what happens when language and law serve domination rather than justice. For me, the lasting image isn't just the horror on screen, but the chilling possibility that such systems are recognizable in the smallest administrative gestures around us. So when people say the film is too much, ask yourself, too much for whom and too much to see? The difference reveals why art like this is banned more often than the power structures it indicts are reformed. What would you do if you were in that room, watching the rules be written? Then there's The Exorcist, the kind of film that doesn't just scare you, it sneaks into whatever you already believe about the world and turns it up to 11. I remember seeing clips as a teenager and feeling something more unsettling than the images themselves. A tug at whatever notions I held about evil, faith, and the thinness of the line between them. That's the genius and the danger of this movie. It wasn't just special effects and shock value, it felt lived in, like you were watching something that could have happened to someone you know. Part of why The Exorcist landed so hard was its insistence on realism. William Friedkin treated the material like a documentary. Medical charts, doctors' consultations, the slow, terrifying decline of a child, all presented with the sterile logic of real life. When Reagan's behavior is examined in hospital lights and clinical terms before the priests arrive, the supernatural doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It slips in around the edges of the plausible. That made audiences do something uncomfortable. They had to choose whether to believe the denial of science or the insistence of the inexplicable. I think that's why reactions were so extreme. Stories of fainting, vomiting, people running from theaters, they weren't just publicity stunts, they were contagious fear. When one person in a crowd starts to panic, the rest feel permission to let their own dread surface. Especially with a film that touches on faith, the contagion isn't just physical, it's spiritual. For some viewers, the movie didn't remain a story, it became a test of belief. If you're already inclined to think certain forces are real, seeing them portrayed so convincingly can confirm and intensify that fear. The film also blurred the line between fiction and faith in another, quieter way. It treated ritual, sacraments, exorcism rites, prayers, with a seriousness usually reserved for documentaries. That respect lent an authenticity that unsettled both believers and skeptics. Catholics who saw a profound representation of their rituals felt uneasy about its depiction of possession. Non-believers found themselves respecting, then fearing, those same rituals. And for people who have ever sat awake wondering if there is something beyond our rational understanding, The Exorcist turned that question into a palpable presence in the room. Personally, what stayed with me wasn't the levitation or the profanity-laced voice. It was the final implication. The scariest thing might not be the demon at all, but our readiness to believe in it. Fear, once let loose, spreads faster than any contagion. And The Exorcist reminded us that belief itself can be a kind of haunting. When a film convinces you to look at the space beneath your certainties and find dread there, you don't forget it when the credits roll. That's why this movie still lingers in conversations about horror, faith, and the power of cinema to make private fears public. Ang Lee's Brokeback Mountain is the kind of film that doesn't shout, it whispers, and sometimes the quietest things are the most explosive. I remember the first time I saw it. Not as a headline or an argument, but in the small, held-breath moments between two men who are learning how to hold each other without ever quite learning how to be held by the world. That tenderness is what made the film dangerous to some and miraculous to others. The story is simple on the surface. Two cowboys, Ennis and Jack, meet on a summer job and carry a private, impossible love through years of marriages, children, and the weight of a society that doesn't know what to do with them. Ang Lee frames their relationship in gestures. The way a shirt is folded and left waiting, the quiet meetings in a trailer, the way a look can contain a lifetime. Those small gestures are where the film's truth lives. They aren't about scandal or shock, they're about the ordinary acts of intimacy that any love story shares. That ordinary intimacy is exactly what made some governments nervous. Brokeback Mountain was banned or censored in multiple countries. Officials balked at the idea of two men loving each other on screen, reducing a nuanced portrayal of human connection to a label, inappropriate or against our values. But censorship doesn't erase the thing it fears. If anything, it magnified the film's core message. When you try to silence tenderness, you only make its existence louder. I think a lot of us who loved the film recognized ourselves in that fear. Not necessarily the fear of violence or spectacle, but the quiet terror of being seen wrong. Have you ever held a hand in public and felt like someone might decide what that gesture meant for you? Brokeback gave shape to that feeling. It showed how love can be both a refuge and a wound when it doesn't fit the stories people expect. The bands tried to say the film was immoral. Watching it, I felt only the opposite. An insistence on humanity. Ang Lee chose restraint as a storytelling tool. There's no melodrama, no revenge plotlines. There's only two people doing the hardest thing, trying to live with the consequences of loving one another in a world built on different assumptions. That restraint is why the censor's reaction feels so revealing. The film doesn't invite outrage, it invites empathy. And maybe that's the real threat. A movie that asks people to see love the way it actually is, messy, tender, defiant. For those of us who've ever hidden a part of ourselves to keep the peace, Brokeback Mountain felt like a mirror. For those who've never had to hide, it was a lesson in how quiet courage can be. The bands didn't make the story scandalous. They only echoed the film's soft, persistent claim that love exists in many forms, and none of them deserve erasure. That whisper of love, even when fenced by rules and expectations, is what keeps this film alive in memory. And it's what we carry forward as we look at the stories that follow. When I first watched The Birth of a Nation, I felt the same contradiction you probably will. Fascinated by how the camera moves, disturbed by what the movie is saying. It's one of those rare pieces of art that forces you to wrestle with two truths at once. This film rewired cinema, and it also spread poisonous lies. From a purely technical point of view, Griffith did things that filmmakers still borrow today. He pushed the idea that a movie could be long and complex with multiple storylines and emotional arcs. He used cross-cutting to build suspense between different scenes, gave actors meaningful close-ups so you could read a face, and staged massive battle sequences that felt cinematic in a way short actualities never did. For many of us who fell in love with movies, those techniques are why film feels like such a powerful language. The way a cut can make your heart race or a shot can make you ache. Watching the craft laid bare in birth is like watching the grammar of a language being invented. But context matters. The very techniques that made the story persuasive also made its lies persuasive. Griffith wrapped racist propaganda in the persuasive tools of cinema: pacing, composition, emotional scoring. The film popularized dehumanizing stereotypes, used white actors in blackface, and explicitly glorified the Ku Klux Klan. That glow of technical mastery makes the message more dangerous, not less. It's like finding a beautifully carved statue made from rotten wood. The surface dazzles, but the core is corrupt. That paradox sits heavy with me. I don't want to dismiss the ingenuity that shaped an art form. At the same time, I can't pretend that innovation excuses the film's role in fueling real-world harm. People protested its screenings, cities banned it, communities recognized early on that this wasn't just a bad movie, it was active propaganda. That reaction matters. It shows film isn't just entertainment, it's a tool that can normalize and amplify ideas for better or worse. So how do we hold both things? I think we do it the same way we approach difficult histories, with honesty and curiosity. We can study Griffith's techniques to understand how cinema communicates, while also naming the ways those techniques were used to demean and manipulate. We can teach the grammar without glossing over the content. It's uncomfortable, but avoiding that discomfort doesn't erase the past. If anything, denying that a pioneering film helped spread racist ideology only lets that ideology hide in plain sight. I want you to picture the power of a camera lens. It can illuminate truth or cast shade. The Birth of a Nation is a warning that brilliance in craft doesn't immunize a work from moral scrutiny. Innovation doesn't absolve ideology, and history can't be clipped out of existence because it makes us uncomfortable. The real lesson is to keep our eyes open, to admire skill where it exists, but never at the cost of ignoring harm. When I first opened Persepolis, I felt like I was peeking through a small, honest window into a world that was both foreign and achingly familiar. Marjane Satrapi draws in stark black and white, no gloss, no distractions, and it forces you to sit with the story the same way a child sits with a truth, blunt, immediate, impossible to ignore. What makes the book unsettling to some and essential to others is that it's not an arsenal of shock or a manifesto. It's a child's account of faith, fear, family, and the slow, confusing arrival of political violence. That simple perspective is what got it banned in Iran. Think about that for a second. A book told through the eyes of a little girl, tracing the awkwardness of schoolyard friendships, the comfort of her grandmother's stories, the surreal experience of being told to cover her hair, and the way adults around her try to make sense of the revolution. None of those scenes are meant to inflame. They simply refuse to turn suffering and absurdity into slogans. Satrapi shows the contradictions, the piety and the hypocrisy, the official certainty and the private doubt. And in doing so, she strips away the myth of a smooth, unified truth. For regimes that rely on the appearance of unquestionable authority, that kind of honesty is dangerous. I remember being a kid and feeling the same small, private rebellions Margie feels, asking an awkward question at the dinner table, noticing that rules didn't apply the same way to everyone, laughing at something you were told to be solemn about. There's a kind of terror in those moments for people in power because they expose the possibility that the story they're selling is just a story. A child's perspective doesn't have the rhetoric of political critique. It has curiosity, and curiosity can crack the hardest facades. Banning Persepolis revealed the opposite of strength. It revealed insecurity. If a memoir like this, simple drawings, candid lines about a young girl's confusion, is judged a threat, it tells you that authorities are afraid of uncertainty. They're afraid a drawing of a child asking why might spread the habit of asking why until it reaches the pillars that hold a system up. What makes Satrapi's work so human is that she never lionizes herself or her family. She lets them be flawed and funny and contradictory. That makes the book feel like something you might have hidden under your mattress as a teenager. Raw, slightly illicit, and capable of changing how you look at the people around you. It reminds us that stories are not just entertainment, they are mirrors. And when people in power ban mirrors, they don't make themselves unbreakable. They admit, without saying it, that they're scared of the reflection. The Passion of the Christ didn't just shock because of blood and nails. It exposed how fragile our shared symbols are. When Mel Gibson's film was banned in several nations, officials cited graphic violence and invoked public morality. But if you talk to people who carry those stories in their bones, grandparents who prayed the rosary, ministers who preached from the pulpit, friends who learned the Passion through Sunday school, you'll hear something else under the surface. The objection wasn't only about eyes being protected, it was about ownership. Who gets to frame the story of the sacred? I remember the first time I saw clips of the movie. I'd grown up on a softer, more abstract depiction of suffering, pale faces in soft light, a focus on forgiveness and resurrection. Gibson's images felt like someone had turned up the contrast on pain itself. Some people I know left the theatre shaken, trembling from the realism. Others were outraged, feeling the portrayal crossed into exploitation. Both reactions came from the same place, a deep attachment to what those images mean. That intensity showed me how even within a single tradition, no picture of divinity is safe from division. When governments or councils ban a film, it rarely functions as simple protection. It becomes an act of claiming the narrative. By suppressing the Passion of the Christ, authorities signaled that certain depictions of Jesus, and therefore certain theological emphases, don't belong in public circulation, at least not under their watch. That's a powerful admission. Censorship, in these moments, is less about shielding people and more about asserting who has the right to tell the sacred story. That dynamic is eerily relatable. Think of a family heirloom, a song, a recipe, a prayer. When someone outside the family reshapes it, we feel an immediate defensiveness. It isn't purely aesthetic, it's about identity and continuity. For many believers, images of Christ function like that heirloom. They carry communal memory, doctrinal meaning, and emotional resonance. A controversial film can feel like a stranger walking into your home and rearranging the furniture of faith. But the bans also revealed something else. That making divinity visible forces interpretation. The same bloody nails that horrified one viewer humanized another. The same scene that seemed sacrilegious to some felt faithful to others because it insisted on the physical reality of suffering. That divergence forced communities to ask, do we prioritize preserving a sanitized, unifying image, or do we allow artistic expression to complicate and challenge our assumptions? I don't want to romanticize conflict. There was real pain, accusations of anti-Semitism, debates about historical accuracy, and legitimate concerns about coercive political use. Yet watching the controversy unfold made me more aware of my own attachments. I found myself sympathizing with both the person who wanted the image removed and the artist demanding space to depict a truth as he saw it. Ultimately, the story surrounding Gibson's film taught me a modest lesson. Reverence is both personal and contested. Attempts to police sacred images reveal not only fear of harm, but a desire to control meaning. And where meaning is tied to identity, control will always invite dispute. If you've ever seen a film that feels less like a movie and more like a memory you didn't live, this is it. When I first watched the Battle of Algiers, I sat forward in my chair because the images didn't ask for my opinion. They demanded my presence. It's a reconstruction, but it feels like a document, street level, immediate, and unsettlingly ordinary. That ordinariness is what makes it so powerful. The film recreates the urban phase of the Algerian Revolution with a quiet, forensic eye. There are no stirring speeches, no obvious villains framed for easy condemnation. Instead, we watch people moving through markets, queues, cafes, citizens whose daily lives are interrupted by checkpoints, raids, and sudden violence. That choice to refuse dramatic moralizing is deliberate. It doesn't let you off the hook. You are forced to experience the logic of occupation as a lived reality, not an ideological debate. What makes the film even more remarkable is how seriously everyone took its realism. Military academies screened it as a study in insurgency and counterinsurgency. Armies dissected its tactics not because they admired the politics, but because the film captured the mechanics of urban struggle so precisely. The bomb in a cafe, the sweep through a neighborhood, the ways fear is cultivated and resisted. That military interest is a kind of tragic compliment. The camera had made the anatomy of repression legible, and yet the film never becomes a manual. Its lens is empathetic rather than didactic. Instead of a narrator telling us who to hate, we see mothers, fathers, children, fighters and collaborators, often filmed in close, unblinking shots that let their faces speak. You can feel their exhaustion, their hesitation, their moments of tenderness. This empathy is not sentimental. It's a refusal to reduce people to propaganda symbols. The silence of the camera, the lack of extraneous music or voiceover, speaks louder than any rallying cry. That silence forces us to sit in the moral ambiguity and human cost of colonialism. That honesty is exactly what made the film dangerous to authorities. In France, it was banned for years, not because it lied or invented grievances, but because it revealed a truth too plainly. An occupation looks like this. People respond like this. When truth is stripped of rhetorical flourish and presented with surgical clarity, it can be destabilizing. Governments fear clarity because it removes the comfortable distance that justifies policy. The ban was an attempt to suspend the mirror that the film held up. On a personal level, the Battle of Algiers matters because it reminds us how film can act like empathy training. Watching it, you begin to notice the small rhythms of occupation, the way a checkpoint slows footsteps, how a mother's lullaby competes with distant explosions. And those observations linger. They shape the way you see news footage, protests, or even the people in your neighborhood who carry histories you don't. That is why the film still resonates. It doesn't tell you what to think, it helps you learn how to feel, and from feeling to understand. Take Ken Russell's The Devils, and you're not watching a period piece so much as being dragged into a waking nightmare about power and shame. Russell stitches together religion, sexuality, and politics into sequences that feel feverish. Stained glass iconography dissolving into carnality, priests turned into grotesques, crowds convulsing between piety and panic. It's loud, messy, and deliberately corrosive. The kind of film that refuses to let you sit comfortably in your moral seat. You might know the headlines. Banned for blasphemy in several countries, butchered by studios worried about the fallout, then tucked away in the archives for years. But the scandal tells only part of the story. Strip back the shock tactics, and what remains is a question that still gnaws. How much of what we call sin is born from private desire? And how much is manufactured by the people who claim the moral high ground? That's why The Devils still matters on a personal level. Think about a time you were told to be ashamed of something small, a crush, a thought, the way you laugh, and watched how quickly that shame spread, not because the act was harmful, but because someone with authority decided it was. Russell stages that dynamic as hysteria, not an organic eruption, but something coaxed out by sermons, rumors, and the machinery of institution. The film's excess isn't gratuitous, it's diagnostic. It shows how condemnation can contort bodies and minds until confession and cruelty look like virtue. On screen, desire is never just private. It becomes a weapon in political games, a justification for repression. Priestly zeal turns into paranoia, and accusations of sin become a fast track to incarceration or violence. Russell isn't asking whether desire exists. He knows it does. He's asking who benefits when that desire is labeled monstrous. And that's a question that reaches beyond 17th century Loudon or 1970s cinema. It's the same question communities, churches, workplaces, and families still face. Who gets to define normal? And what tools do they use when people don't comply? Watching The Devils can feel uncomfortable because it holds up a mirror to the moments we outsource our moral compass. Maybe you felt relief when someone else called the thing wrong. It releases responsibility. Or felt crushed when a label stuck. Russell forces us to examine that impulse, to see how quickly moral certainty can morph into persecution. So yes, the film shocks. But beneath the spectacle is a cold, clear interrogation. Is sin intrinsic to desire, or is it a mask for power? That ambiguity, the refusal to settle on easy answers, is what keeps the film alive, and what makes its censorship feel like exactly the point. Bertolucci's The Last Tango in Paris didn't scandalize because it showed sex. Cinema had been edging into explicit territory for years, but because it showed what sex can hide. At the surface, the film was accused of obscenity, explicit images, blunt language, a refusal to prettify the body. Censors recoiled, judges banned it, newspapers ran moral outrages. But strip away the headlines, and you find what always made me uneasy the first time I saw it, an emptiness so big it turned tenderness into a weapon. Think of the anonymous apartment where much of the film takes place. Two strangers meet in rooms that have no history together, no photos, no traces of a life lived for two. That absence becomes a stage. The sex is raw and immediate, but it's less about connection than about performance. A choreography of avoidance. You can almost feel the grief in the man's hands, like a background noise that never quite goes away. People often remember the explicitness. I remember the silence between the scenes, the way both characters use pleasure to lubricate pain they won't look at. That's the disturbing lesson. Intimacy can be a form of violence. Not necessarily violent in the cinematic, brutal sense, but violent in how it uses another person to erase, to anesthetize. When two people let themselves be used as a balm, when contact becomes a substitute for conversation, when touch substitutes for accountability, it's a kind of harm. The film doesn't moralize. It offers no neat judgments, which is part of why it unsettled people. It forces you to recognize how pleasure can be a mask for grief, how what feels like liberation can actually be concealment. Make it personal for a moment. We've all been in those hollow moments, haven't we? The late-night message to someone we don't really know, the turning to a familiar hand to stop our chest from hurting, the habit of mistaking heat for healing. Watching Last Tango can feel like seeing a private failure reflected back at you on a giant screen. That recognition is uncomfortable. It's easier to call it obscene and ban it than to sit with that image of yourself and the small, ugly choices you've made to avoid feeling. That's exactly why the bans mattered. Banning the film didn't protect people from corruption. It prevented them from having the argument the film demanded. It closed down a space where society could have asked hard questions. What do we mean by consent when grief erases boundaries? How does a culture that prizes sexual freedom also respond to the way sex can be used to avoid pain? Censorship turned reflection into silence. And that silence has consequences beyond one film. When public debate is shut down in favor of moral outrage, our collective understanding of intimacy remains shallow. Films like Last Tango are uncomfortable precisely because they refuse comforting answers. They make us look at the ways desire can wound and the ways solace can be cruel. If we watch honestly, we don't leave the theatre feeling titillated. We leave feeling unsettled, maybe a little ashamed, and if we're brave, a little more aware. So asking whether the movie was obscene misses the point. The real provocation was its insistence that intimacy isn't always tender. That sometimes what looks like connection is a means of survival, and that survival can be a form of harm. That's the conversation we avoided when we banned it. And that's the conversation we still need to have. Cannibal Holocaust, a film that doesn't ask to be watched so much as it forces itself into your head and won't leave. On the surface, it's the kind of exploitation that earned it outright bans in more than 50 countries. Graphic violence, real animal killings, Images so raw audiences walked out and governments pulled it from theaters. But if you dig even a little, you find something stranger and more modern than mere shock value. Imagine a group of filmmakers who vanish while making a documentary about an isolated tribe. Then, months later, their footage turns up, shaky, silent, filmed like something discovered in a box. That framing was genius and cruel. The movie presents itself as recovered documentary, collapsing the distance between audience and atrocity. It's the first time I felt a film reach out and touch my stomach with one hand while mocking me with the other. Look, you're complicit too. What makes Cannibal Holocaust linger is its critique of media, not plainly stated, but baked into every frame. The journalists in the story aren't noble truth seekers. They're aggressive, sensationalist opportunists. They hunt pain for a byline. They edit suffering into spectacle. As viewers, we giggle nervously when the film turns its camera on brutality because we recognize the posture, the press box smile, the voiceover that tugs at empathy just enough to sell a story. That recognition is uncomfortable because, deep down, we've all clicked on that story, watched that clip, shared it, and moved on. The movie blurred fiction and reality so convincingly that director Ruggero Deodato was actually arrested and charged with murder. The authorities believed some of the actors had been killed for real on camera. That moment, of a court taking a film as evidence of actual death, is an eerie mirror held to our marketplace of images. If a work of fiction can so convincingly replicate atrocity that it's indistinguishable from fact, what does that say about the ethics of representation and who pays the cost when spectacle eclipses humanity? For many viewers, the real horror in Cannibal Holocaust isn't the staged cannibalism. It's the larger idea that people, including the media and, yes, us as viewers, have an appetite for spectacles of suffering. We want something shocking enough to feel alive in a world numbed by constant content. I don't mean to accuse anyone here. I'm guilty too. I've clicked on the brutal clip because curiosity pricked at me, because the headline promised an adrenaline spike, because watching from safety made me feel like an expert about someone else's pain. That's the sting of the film. It forces a moral tally. Are you watching to understand or to consume? Deodato's work is ugly and indefensible in many ways, especially in its real animal cruelty. Yet it also asks a vital question we still dodge. What happens to empathy when entertainment commodifies trauma? As we move on to the next film, keep that tension in mind. The horror we seek in movies often reflects back the hunger we feed in ourselves. Then came The Great Dictator, and with it, one of the boldest acts of cultural defiance in film history. Imagine the scene. Europe is on the brink, radios crackle with propaganda, and a comedian who built his career making people laugh decides to point that laughter directly at the face of tyranny. That's exactly what Charlie Chaplin did. He took the very tool a dictator uses, the spectacle of power, and turned it inside out with a wink and a pratfall. Chaplin's film was so threatening to those regimes that it was banned in Nazi Germany and its allied territories even before it premiered. They knew instinctively that ridicule is a kind of exposure. When you laugh at a dictator, you stop treating him as an infallible, godlike figure. You strip away the armor of fear. For me, that's the most powerful lesson of The Great Dictator. That humor doesn't make light of suffering, it illuminates it. It creates distance from the images that intimidation tries to build and invites people to see the human absurdity behind the costume of absolute power. He didn't go about this with gloves on. Chaplin created two mirror images, the humble Jewish barber, awkward and gentle, and Adenoid Hinkle, a ridiculous parody of the Führer. Watching him switch between those roles is like watching someone carefully unmask a theatre of cruelty. Hinkle's pomp and bizarre gestures are exaggerated until they look almost childlike, and in doing so, Chaplin makes tyrants look less like monsters and more like frightened children playing at being gods. That's infuriating to anyone who depends on fear to rule. It's also deeply humanizing, not in a way that excuses harm, but in a way that suggests these systems are built, maintained, and therefore changeable. I remember the first time I watched the film and sat through the final speech. It hits different when you know the context. The world was already burning when Chaplin spoke his simple, earnest lines about kindness, democracy, and the dignity of the individual. Some critics expected the comedian to stop clowning and turn into a moralist, but Chaplin fused the two. The last monologue isn't a sermon, it's a plea that uses the same intimate voice he used to make us laugh. That contrast is what makes it land. Humor opened a door, and then Chaplin walked through it with a heartfelt call to conscience. There's something inherently democratic about laughter. You can't be both terrified and amused in the same moment. Satire dissolves the ritual of reverence that totalitarian systems demand. In practical terms, that meant audiences could see their oppressors as fallible, not omnipotent, and even a small seed of doubt can grow into resistance. Chaplin understood that revolutions don't always start with guns. Sometimes they start with a shift in perception. One smirk, one whispered joke, one quietly shared scene in a cinema could make people feel less alone and more willing to resist the momentum of fear. On a personal level, this idea resonates with everyday life. Think about moments when a joke eased tension in a difficult meeting, or when a shared laugh made a heavy day feel lighter. It doesn't erase the problem, but it changes what we can do next. Chaplin's film scaled that idea up to a world in crisis. He risked everything, his career, his safety, his reputation, to use laughter as an act of courage, to show that comedy can be a form of protest. The Great Dictator reminds us that art doesn't need to be quiet in the face of danger. It can be loud, it can be absurd, and it can cut through the noise with a smile. Tyrants fear ridicule because it takes away their power to make us believe they're unstoppable. Chaplin's genius wasn't just in the jokes or the gags. It was in believing that a film could change how people saw the world. And in that belief, he offered a kind of revolution that anyone can join, one smile at a time. Apocalypse Now isn't just a war movie. It's a slow, relentless excavation of what war does to the human mind. I still remember the first time I watched it, not in a classroom or a film club, but late at night, headphones on, the living room suddenly turning into something that felt both beautiful and deeply wrong. The helicopters scream in through the speakers like a physical force, and for a moment you can't tell whether you're watching an army or watching a fever. Coppola pushed every boundary he could find. That's part of why the film was censored in several countries. Not because it lacked artistry, but because it refused to prettify violence. It lays bare scenes that are disorienting and visceral. The napalm-lit night, the surreal beach party with Do Lung Bridge's absurdity, the encounters that oscillate between theatre and pure madness. There's an honesty to it that feels almost cruel. It shows how destruction can be awful and gorgeous at the same time. A sunset behind burning trees, a river reflecting fire. That contradiction is unsettling because it rings true. Humans can find awe in catastrophe, and Coppola doesn't shy away from that uncomfortable mirror. But the film's real power is in its descent. At the start, it's a mission. Captain Willard is sent upriver to terminate Colonel Kurtz. That framing feels like a straightforward journey. The longer you watch, the less straightforward it becomes. The river becomes a corridor not just through Vietnam, but through Willard's and the audience's psyche. Scenes accumulate like pressure. Each stop adds a layer of bewilderment, suspicion, and moral erosion. By the time you reach Kurtz, you're not sure who you're supposed to pity or condemn. Heroism and horror have braided together so tightly, they're indistinguishable. It's personal because the film makes you complicit. You lean in, you watch people fall apart, and you can't look away. That tension between voyeurism and empathy, is what haunts me. Coppola doesn't give easy answers. Kurtz's monologues, muffled and mythic, challenge the language of righteousness we've been raised on. Willard's silent stare is the only honest response left. The jungle stops being a setting and starts to feel like a character, dense, invasive, indifferent. It's easy to say the jungle is a place, but the movie insists otherwise. It becomes a map of interior darkness. You begin to suspect that the true mission was never about borders or commands. It was about confronting the fact that the heart can be a wilderness. When the credits finally roll, the silence feels less like relief and more like a dare. Apocalypse now doesn't resolve anything neatly. It hands you the residue of an experience and expects you to live with it. That lingering unease is the point. If a film can make you examine how fragile your own morality is when pressure builds, then it's done more than narrate history. It's reflected a part of you back that you might prefer to ignore. Natural-born killers. Oliver Stone's fever dream of a movie that didn't just tell a story, it held up a mirror and filmed us staring back. If you haven't felt that jolt, imagine watching something that's never meant to give you a comfortable place to stand. Rapid-fire edits, TV-saturated visuals, a soundtrack that switches from lullaby to bomb blast, and protagonists who are marketed like rock stars even while they're killing people. It's art that feels like an accusation. I remember the first time I saw it. I felt almost sick, but more awake. The whole point wasn't to glamorize violence. It was to show how easily we glamorize people who commit it. Stone and screenwriter Quentin Tarantino, whose comfortable chair this was briefly, made a satire so loud and stylish that the satire itself looked like the thing it was mocking. TV news shows calling killers celebrity couples, screaming anchors, and audiences watching with detached fascination. The film folds all of that into its DNA and plays it back to us until we can't pretend we weren't watching ourselves. That reflex of self-recognition is what sparked the real-world backlash. Pretty quickly, natural-born killers attracted not just critics, but legal attention. People argued the film inspired copycat crimes. Censorship movements pointed fingers, and in some places, the movie was effectively banned or heavily edited. The headline-friendly narrative was simple and seductive. Show violent images, and you get violent people. But that's a tidy story that lets everyone off the hook. It turns a mirror into an excuse. If a film made someone violent, then the audience needn't look at the social forces that made violence desirable in the first place. Censorship, in that context, wasn't just about protecting viewers. It was about protection of a larger image, of media systems, of cultural appetites. Stone's movie did something dangerous for powerful institutions. It suggested they profit from chaos. And if the culture profits from chaos, then maybe the culture also wants it. That idea is uncomfortable because it points at collective responsibility. It's easier to blame a film than to admit that millions of people tune in, click, and share the spectacle of destruction. What the censors feared, and what critics still fear, is being forced to see that appetite. Natural-born killers doesn't flatter. It doesn't give us a cathartic villain to hate at a safe distance. Instead, it shows a carnival mirror of ourselves laughing and clapping as the sideshow unfolds. The film's mirror didn't flatter, so they tried to shatter it. That line isn't just poetic, it was a strategy. If the reflection is unbearable, erase the image, ban the film, cut the scenes, find someone to blame who isn't yourself. But banning also tells its own story. When you outlaw a mirror, you reveal what you're afraid to see. In the aftermath of Natural-Born Killers, the discussion shifted from whether the movie was art to what art could be responsible for. That tension between creative provocation and social consequence became a battleground. And I think, personally, that's why the film still matters. Because it forces an uncomfortable question we prefer to dodge. Are we passive consumers of stories, or are we part of the machinery that creates and rewards spectacle? Maybe you felt this conflict when scrolling a feed, laughing at a clip, then pausing because it's grotesque. Maybe you recognize how quickly outrage becomes an engine for more outrage and how hard it is to step off. Natural-born killers didn't invent that wheel. It just sped it up and shone a spotlight on the spokes. Whether you love the film, hate it, or fall somewhere in between, its controversy is a mirror we're still avoiding. And every time a new outrage goes viral, the question it raised keeps coming back. What happens when entertainment shows us our worst impulses, and then we applaud? Next up, the Human Centipede. Even saying the title out loud makes people pause. And that pause is exactly the reaction the film was built to provoke. On paper, it's simple and deliberately grotesque. A deranged surgeon, 3 victims, and a surgical procedure designed to turn strangers into a single, horrific organism. The imagery is shocking by design, but the reason it's stuck in so many minds goes deeper than shock value. It forces us to reckon with an uncomfortable question. Why do we look at something we know will disgust us? I remember when I first heard about it. I hadn't seen the film, but the conversations were everywhere. Online forums, late-night podcasts, people at parties daring each other to describe what they'd heard. That cultural whispering created an odd, collective curiosity. Maybe you've been there too. You scroll past a headline that promises something ridiculous or terrible, and yet you click. The Human Centipede tapped directly into that impulse and then doubled down. Censorship reacted predictably. Authorities in several countries banned or demanded cuts, and some theaters refused to screen it. Those attempts to bury the film only fed its notoriety. When something is outlawed or labeled too extreme, it becomes a forbidden fruit, and human beings are remarkably attracted to forbidden fruit. The Streisand effect is real. Trying to suppress a piece of art like this often amplifies its reach because people want to see what everyone else is talking about. But fascination isn't the same as endorsement. For most of us, watching a film like this isn't a comfortable experience. It's an exercise in boundary testing. We watch not because we enjoy the images, but because we want to understand why those images provoke such strong reactions. Curiosity meets moral revulsion. You might find yourself alternating between disgust, morbid curiosity, and a weird, guilty intrigue. That emotional roller coaster is exactly the texture of extreme horror. It doesn't aim to soothe, it aims to unsettle. There's also a psychological layer that's easy to miss if you only fixate on the gore. The film asks, in a distorted way, about control and consent. Who has power over another person's body? What would curiosity, voyeurism, or a perverse need for control do to human compassion? For viewers, confronting those questions can be oddly revealing. It's less about the spectacle and more about what the spectacle exposes in us. Do we recoil and walk away? Do we rationalize and justify? Or do we stare until we've mentally catalogued every element of our discomfort? Artists and critics are split on whether The Human Centipede is exploitative shock theatre or a crude allegory about human cruelty and curiosity. Both readings exist, and maybe both are true. That tension is part of what keeps the film alive in cultural conversations. It sits at the crossroads between exploitation and social commentary, and that ambiguity is what makes it useful to discuss. Not to glamorize the grotesque, but to probe why such material attracts attention in the first place. If you've ever clicked on something knowing you'd regret it, you already understand the film's strange appeal. The Human Centipede is a mirror held up to our baser impulses, the part of us that's curious about taboos, the part that is drawn to the forbidden, and the part that wants to define the limits of art by testing them. Censorship can try to bury content like this, but as history shows, taboo survives, often thriving underground, in the same places where our communal anxieties and curiosities find their most uncomfortable expressions. Transitioning from that underground notoriety, the next film we'll look at explores a different kind of taboo, one that masks itself behind everyday normalcy. I remember the first time I saw Life of Brian. I was younger, a bit stubborn, and secretly delighted by anything that dared to poke holes in what everyone around me accepted without question. The film feels like it was made especially for that part of you that hates being told what to believe simply because it's tradition. On the surface, it's a riot, clever one-liners, absurd situations, and the kind of physical comedy that makes you laugh even before you get the joke. But underneath, it's asking a serious question. Why do humans follow authority so willingly? And what happens when faith becomes a machine rather than a comfort? When the film came out, it was banned in several places as blasphemous. That always struck me as revealing. The outrage wasn't so much a description of what the film did, it was a reaction to what it dared to question. Monty Python weren't writing gags to sneer at people's beliefs. They were targeting the mechanics of blind faith. The way slogans replace thought, leaders take advantage of certainty, and rituals get divorced from compassion. The humor comes from exposing the absurd, not from denying the personal solace people find in belief. There's a rawness to the comedy that still hits me. Take the scene where crowds mistake a perfectly ordinary man for a messiah. It's painfully funny because it's so believable. We've all seen people latch onto ideas because they simplify life or make them feel safe. The film shows how fear can be harnessed, how comfort can be sold, and how laughter can act as a small revolt against that. It made me feel less alone in questioning things, and more confident that doubt isn't an insult to faith. It can be a path to honesty. The bans and the protests only amplified the movie's point. Censoring a satire that asks uncomfortable questions made it seem more dangerous, not because the film attacked belief, but because it threatened the complacency that protects power. Suddenly, it was impossible to ignore. Decades later, knowing it was once verboten feels less like stigma and more like a badge of bravery. It tells us the filmmakers were willing to risk backlash to spark a conversation. On a personal level, Life of Brian taught me that humor can be a kind of courage. It showed me that laughing at our own foibles doesn't strip us of dignity. It frees us from the fear that keeps us silent. If you ever feel boxed in by rules you don't understand, this film is a reminder that questions, asked kindly but persistently, can open the door to clearer thinking and kinder communities. Imagine standing at the edge of a stadium filled with tens of thousands of uniformed bodies, flags snapping in a perfect rhythm, a single figure rising above the crowd like a statue come alive. That's the opening feeling of Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Not a documentary in the neutral sense, but a crafted experience that pulls you inside a political ritual. Shot at the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, the film was celebrated by some for its technical daring and promptly banned after the war because it so clearly exists to glorify Nazi ideology. That contradiction is where the film becomes both fascinating and deeply dangerous. What's hypnotic about Triumph is its mastery of cinematic tools. Riefenstahl used low-angle shots to monumentalize leaders, sweeping crane movements to turn crowds into choreography, and close-ups timed with music to focus our emotional attention. The editing is rhythmic. Moments breathe and then snap shut in exact sync with the orchestral score. As a viewer, you feel the pull. The images make something enormous look inevitable, beautiful even. That's the film's power. It makes spectacle indistinguishable from truth. But beauty here is not innocent. Every aesthetic choice serves a political end. The camera doesn't simply record people. It shapes how we understand them. Marching feet become a force of nature. Faces in the crowd dissolve into a sea of sameness, erasing individuality in favor of the collective will. Riefenstahl's eye turns human beings into symbols and symbols into a religion of power. That's why it was banned, because it stripped away moral context and replaced it with worshipful imagery. I remember the first time I watched clips of the film in a university class. Initially, I admired the craft, the innovative shots, the use of light, but that admiration quickly soured as I realized how those very techniques smoothed the path for violence. It was unsettling to feel aesthetic pleasure and moral repulsion at the same time. That discomfort is crucial. It's what makes the film valuable to study, not as a monument to genius, but as a cautionary example of how art can be weaponized. Scholars still screen Triumph of the Will in film schools and history courses, and for good reason. It teaches technical lessons that are hard to deny: composition, movement, propaganda mechanics, while forcing us to ask harder questions about responsibility. When we admire a shot, are we inadvertently admiring its purpose? Can we separate form from function? Those are not academic quibbles. They're conversations about how images shape beliefs and how easy it is to fall for style when substance is rotten. So how do we watch a film like this responsibly? First, with context, understanding who made it, why, and at what cost. Second, with critical distance, being aware of our own emotional responses and tracing them back to the techniques that produced them. And finally, with a commitment to remember that aesthetics are tools that can build empathy or bulldoze ethics. Triumph of the Will is a masterclass in cinematic manipulation and a stark reminder that beauty without ethics can serve evil all too well.